Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. Ngā mihi nui kia koutou katoa. Welcome everyone to this United Nations Association of New Zealand webinar. I'm Phoebe Slee, and together with Sunniva Fredstad, we are the events coordinators. On behalf of the UNIN's national branch, myself and Sunniva Fredstad, thank you for being here. Special greetings and thanks to our panelists, Dr. Olaf Morgenstern, Pip Best, and Professor Priya Kurian, and of course our moderator, Honourable Julianne Genter. Our panelists will discuss the takeaways from the IPCC's 6th Assessment Report and how the report should be utilised for an effective COP26 in November in the fight against climate change. Before I hand over to Julianne to formally open our webinar with a karakia, I'll just give some housekeeping. While you can see us, you will not be able to see, we won't be able to see you or hear you, so don't worry if you have a cup of tea or a dog in the background. Each panelist will speak for approximately 10 minutes each, and we will have a question period for at least half an hour at the end. You're welcome to speak to other attendees in the chat room, but if you have any questions you want us to raise for the question period at the end, please enter these into the Q&A chat, which Sunniva and I will be monitoring. Unfortunately, we may not get to every question, but we've been told that panelists are open to us sending them questions and have us distribute these answers to you all. So let's get into it. We're lucky enough to have Honourable Julianne Genter, List MP for the Green Party, as the moderator of the panel. Julianne is currently Deputy Chairperson of the Transport and Infrastructure Select Committee and is the Green Party spokesperson for several portfolios, including COVID-19 response, as well as building and construction. Julianne is a BA graduate of UC Berkeley, has a postgraduate certificate in International Political Studies from Sciences Po Paris, and a Master's in Planning Practice, first class from the University of Auckland. Before entering politics, Julianne's career was in transport and urban planning, where she advised local and central government and private firms on evaluation of transport projects. I'll now pass on over to Julianne to lead the panel.
Tēnā koutou katoa. I'm just going to start with a brief karakia, and it's a new one for me, so excuse any pronunciation. I'll do my best. Kia tō namanakitanga a te meo naro. Ki runga ki tēnā a tātou. Kia mahea te hua mā kihi kihi. Kia toi te kupu, toi te mana, toi te aroha, toi te reo Māori. Kia tūturu, ka whakamoa kia tina, huie, taekie. Let the strength and life force of our ancestors be with each and every one of us, freeing our path from obstruction so that our words, spiritual power, love, and language are upheld, permanently fixed, established, and understood, forward together. Thank you so much for that introduction and for the invitation to chair this very interesting panel discussion. I'll just start with a brief story about myself and I guess my values. Growing up, I never imagined that I would be a politician. I was in the United States where I couldn't see politicians that reflected my values or looked anything like me. So I didn't think politics was a way to solve the problems that I saw around us. But I was keenly aware of social challenges and environmental challenges, and I very much wanted to be part of the solution, and I wanted my work to do that. So I studied various things, and I ended up specializing in urban planning because I could see in our urban environments an opportunity for really practical solutions that would address climate change, water and air quality issues, that could lead to more vibrant, people-oriented neighborhoods where some of our social challenges were diminished with affordable housing, affordable transport, equitable access. But when I started my work as a transportation planner in Aotearoa, New Zealand, I quite quickly realized that technical solutions were not sufficient to solve this problem. Having the evidence and the vision at a technical or professional level was not sufficient to see that implemented. And that's when I realized, I think, that we actually did need political leadership to make the changes that could benefit us and our planet. So I was drawn to the Green Party, and I ended up standing for Parliament, and I've now been in Parliament for 10 years. Last term, I had this enormous privilege of serving as one of the first 3 Green ministers in Aotearoa, New Zealand, as Minister for Women and Associate Minister of Transport and Health. And I think that just reflecting on the IPCC report, which is obviously an incredible piece of work, and it tells us very clearly that we're facing an incredible challenge, that we have to act urgently, that we need global cooperation in order to solve this problem. And ultimately, it will be a political process globally and at a local level that will enable us to implement the solutions that, frankly, we already know exist. And so I think our biggest challenge is not a technical challenge. We do need to understand the science, to have it laid out, to constantly monitor and evaluate the solutions that are proposed to ensure that they are effective. But we cannot do this through a top-down technocratic process. We actually need people and communities on the ground to be part of developing and implementing these solutions. From my point of view, one of the things that probably needs to be talked about quite a lot more in order to address our climate challenges is how to ensure that we have governance and representation that really truly represents people, so that we don't have vested interests or a few who represent the status quo blocking progress. And, electoral systems, voting systems, democratic institutions, the way these are run, the way they interact with communities on the ground is a fundamental part. If we can get that right, then implementing the solutions will be so much easier. And you can see, since I'm from the United States, I'll just briefly refer to the United States. Some of the challenges they've had, and you could say, oh, well, that's just democracy. But the truth is the electoral system and the representation system in the United States is vastly different to that in Aotearoa, New Zealand. And it doesn't represent all voices equally. And that is part of the problem and part of the reason that they've had difficulty increasing inequality, government policies that don't represent the wishes and values of most of the people. And it's very hard to engage people in voting if they don't feel like their voices are heard through that voting system. So that will be my reflection as a professional turned politician on how we can respond to the IPCC's report and hopefully implement some of the recommendations. But I'd like to move on to our excellent panel and speakers. So first, I'm going to introduce Pip Best. Pip Best is an Ernst & Young Oceania partner and the New Zealand Climate Change and Sustainability Services leader. Her current role includes supporting businesses to consider their financial and sustainability commitments in relation to climate change sustainability and adapting how businesses measure short-term returns and long-term costs. Pip has a Bachelor of Engineering and Finance from the University of Melbourne. Previously, she has worked in capital markets and sustainability roles, as well as developing sustainable financial products in Asia Pacific.
Thanks, Julie. Tēnā koutou katoa. With my great panel members to follow that will focus on the science and public policy. Sorry, I'm just trying to get the light a little bit, not so, sorry, I'm kind of half in the sun, half in the shade. I'm going to focus on what the report, the AR6 report and COP means to business, which is really what my team does day in, day out. The AR6 report provides nearly 4,000 pages of content. It contains messages on both the physical risks created by our changing climate, but also the rate of decarbonisation that we require to really align to the Paris Agreement. We have extracted, I guess, 5 key things we believe the private sector needs to do in response to the AR6 report if they're not already doing these things. So I'll take you through these 5 things, and then I'll briefly take you through some other work our team is really focused on in the sustainable finance space. Our 5 key takeaways from the report is firstly to apply the science. So Julie just spoke about understanding the science, but we believe that businesses, organisations, everyone has basically an obligation to actually apply the science. And we actually believe that shareholders also would have this expectation, which is very important for business, because it really means directors have a duty to understand the impacts of climate change. So we expect that climate change will both have an impact on businesses in terms of the physical changes, but also it will have impacts in terms of their rapid decarbonisation that our Climate Change Commission report are signalling are required. And so firstly, we expect that businesses will need to do a significant amount of work to understand these risks and opportunities. Secondly, we think the report provides I guess, a new set of evidence to update expectations of businesses. They present new scenarios called the shared socio-economic pathways. And the report also suggests that both the transition and physical risks will be larger and earlier than we might have previously assumed. And so we believe that businesses should be revising any past work they've done or any work they are currently doing aligned to this update that we've now got around the science. We also think the report is another signal that we need to start better differentiating between acute risks and chronic risks. Historically, when we see businesses considering climate change, sometimes everything is bundled together under this broad band of climate change, or sometimes what the kind of physical implications of climate change are. However, acute risks and chronic risks have very different implications in terms of how you manage those types of risks. So acute risks are short-term events that are made more likely by climate change, such as wildfires and flooding, where chronic risks are the result of more gradual trends which occur over time, and we have a lot of more certainty around, such as sea level rise, ocean acidification. So AR6 predicts that both these types of risks will be earlier and stronger and more persistent than we previously modelled. And we do think that the report provides more information about differentiating kind of risk management responses to the different ranges of risks. Our third insight from the report is that we need to think locally. Well, more locally, maybe I should say. The AR6 provides the interactive atlas, which looks at some of the climate change trends on a regional basis. And what it shows is that actually some of those trends do differentiate depending where you are located. For example, the world has warmed by 1.09 degrees Celsius, but Australia has warmed by 1.4 degrees Celsius. So there are these regional impacts which actually have different implications depending on your location. And we do think that AR6 provides some very useful information to better understand what it means for your region. Our fourth insight is really about communication. The AR6 report has some amazing graphics in it. They are there for a reason, and they're there to be very visual and to try and be easily digestible to get their point across. One of the biggest things we think people can do with this report is try and share those graphics and share that communication, both with friends, colleagues, but also within your organisation. You know, it should be in slide packs to investors. It should go out to senior management. It should be information that the board sees. We think that this is a huge opportunity on the back of AR6 and in the lead up to COP to make the business case for greater action on climate change. So using evidence such as the key findings from the AR6 report and this time where there is so much attention on climate change is really, I guess, for us, a really good time to try and progress the discussions particularly about the long-term science, and try and move away from this short-term political focus or the short-term financial return focus, and really kind of take opportunity of AR6 and the lead up to COP and the momentum that we're seeing behind that. The last insight from the report is around the kind of urgency to decarbonise our impacts. So we know this, but the report really highlights that further emissions will drive further warming. So it really reinforces the importance of decarbonisation and very rapid decarbonisation. So we would also think, or we would expect that shareholders, for instance, would expect that organisations are measuring and reporting their emissions, that they're developing emission reduction targets aligned to the carbon budget set out by the Paris Agreement, and that they have emission reduction strategies, and that these strategies are costed and they have transparency about how they're going to reach these commitments. We do see a lot of commitments that have historically come out. We see less around the transparency of how these commitments are going to be met. So we think that that's a big area that we will expect more work to be done in the coming years. We also think that the access to capital might become linked to these types of things. And so that really is the area that I'm just going to delve a little bit deeper into. So I also sit on the leadership group of what is called the Centre for Sustainable Finance in New Zealand. This group is really tasked with trying to incorporate environmental and social outcomes into financial decision making. And so obviously climate change is one of these key environmental issues that we are seeing huge focus on, and is really kind of topical in the work that we're doing under the Centre for Sustainable Finance. So I thought I would just give you a little bit of context about what we are seeing at the centre and what we're focused on in the lead up to COP. And this is around trying to embed sustainability into financial decision making. Firstly, we're encouraging the setting of net zero targets, but we're also encouraging this additional transparency on the pathways and the cost to achieve these targets. And we think, again, that will be an area that internationally is growing in focus. We're working on promoting better access to non-financial data and information. So we do see one of the key barriers for maybe more rapid or probably kind of more clarity on climate change being access to good quality data, and particularly on the physical side. And so one of our focus points is how do we try and make this data more accessible to everybody, so we can all get an understanding of what climate change means to us, rather than maybe those that have the ability to access that information, or I guess the finance to access that information, get it first and can make decisions before we really understand what this means for us. We're working on developing better guidance on what sustainability means and what it means across each sector. So we're actually building on work that has been done out of Europe, which is called the European Taxonomy, or the EU Taxonomy. And this taxonomy in Europe covers 80% of European emissions. And for each sector that it covers, it sets out specific technical definitions of what environmental sustainability means. And it covers climate change, it covers biodiversity, it covers water, waste, and pollution. And that sounds quite great, but how much impact will that have? Well, actually in Europe, they're supporting it by regulation, so that they are proposed and have agreed that companies will need to start reporting against this taxonomy, what percentage of their CapEx and OpEx aligns to this taxonomy, and investors will need to start reporting what percentage of their investment portfolios also align to this taxonomy. So that's a significant shift in terms of transparency and in terms of having very clear understanding of what sustainability means. What does it mean to be aligned to the Paris Agreement? And the last area I just wanted to highlight was work we're doing around governance and capability building. As part of our work, so the Centre for Sustainable Finance was really developed under the HRO Circle. We have had 2 legal opinions published on director duties and climate change and trustee duties and climate change, highlighting what I was trying to focus on before around the shareholders' expectations are that businesses are understanding climate risk and what it means for their business. But we're also working, again, based on work out of Europe, which I personally think is hopefully a huge significant shift on this move from shareholder capitalism to stakeholder capitalism. So in the EU, there is a corporate sustainability directive that will require companies down to SMEs to start reporting under what they call this double materiality lens. So historically, companies are required to report on what is financially material to that organisation. In Europe, they're broadening that out. So you have to report under that financial materiality lens, but you also need to report under an environmental and social materiality lens. So you will need to start reporting on what impacts your business has on the environment and on society. And I guess that hopefully, again, should increase transparency and then hopefully action on these key topics. So that's a brief overview of what we see the report meaning and what we're focusing on under the Centre for Sustainable Finance. We're hoping that in the lead up to COP, we can get this message out, we can get more rapid action because, there is a lot happening, but the actual action still isn't happening fast enough. And so I'll just leave it there and just say, it feels like things are starting to move, but we still need to keep pushing because the pace, we're not there yet in terms of pace. So I'll pass back to you, Julie.
Thank you so much, Pip. That was really interesting. Our second speaker is Dr. Olaf Morgenstern, a climate and atmosphere principal scientist at NIWA. Olaf is a lead author of the 6th assessment report of the IPCC and is leading the climate variability and change program that works on predicting climate regionally and globally. Olaf is in the Unified Model Global Model Configuration Group, is part of the UK Chemistry and Aerosols Project, and is a member of the Scientific Steering Committee of the Chemistry Climate Model Initiative. Olaf has a diploma in physics from Freiburg University and a PhD in meteorology from ETH Zurich.
Right, thanks so much, Julie. I'm going to follow Pip's suggestion and share some graphics. Hopefully you can see what I can see. So are you seeing the proper presenter screen? Yes, you do. Okay. Tēnā koutou katoa. So as Julie said, I'm a lead author on the 6th assessment report, and I'll share some, basic key messages of the report with you. And then I'll spend a little bit of time thinking about what the role of the report may be or should be in the context of the 26th Conference of the Parties, COP26, which is coming up in November. So here's one of these basic plots, hopefully easy to communicate. So this is basically the last 12,000 years of the global mean surface temperature. The plot on the left is, resolution is about centuries. The plot in the middle has a resolution of about decades, and the plot on the right is an annual resolution. And the important thing to take away here is that the end point of that graph is, at about 1.1 degrees above the pre-industrial temperature. So this is a number that Pip just mentioned. And that temperature is now warmer than at any time in these past 12,000 years. Last time the temperature was at a similar level would have been about 120,000 years ago, when humans were, Homo sapiens was competing with Neanderthals at that time. And it's not just that we are warmer than at any time in the history of our civilization, also the rate of change that we're experiencing is enormously large. It's bigger than what we would have seen at the end of the Ice Age, for example. So this is all cause of concern. So the 5th assessment report, which came out in 2013, only had 1 degree as the amount of warming that we've seen, but we now have, well, an additional nearly 0.1 degree, which is due in large part to additional warming that happened in the intervening 8 years. And now the warming itself has a lot of consequences. One was that extreme events become more frequent. So this is one of these visualizations of what that means. So if, for example, on the left side here, if, in the pre-industrial time, an event happened once in 10 years, that is a hot extreme event. under 1.5 degrees of warming, it would happen 4 times in 10 years, and under 4 degrees of warming, it would happen almost every year. Or if you have a 1 in 50-year event, well, under 1.5 degrees of warming, it becomes a 1 in 9-year event. So in other words, these extreme events, these hot episodes become a lot more frequent, and they also become, hotter. The amplitude grows. That's the bottom row there. So that holds for heat waves. It also holds for floods and other extremes that we worry about. And these floods, as we've seen in the media recently, can become very costly. Now, if we look, at the future, as Pip mentioned, the future in the Sixth Assessment Report is laid out in these 5 scenarios. They are essentially projections of the future of human behavior, conflicts and wars, or collaboration and mitigation, and so on, are all factored into these storylines. And from this, others have derived CO2 and other emissions of greenhouse gases. And then they're ranked from, high emission to, well, high mitigation scenarios, essentially. And only the most optimistic of these scenarios, the ones in dark blue and light blue here, would keep us to less than 1.5 or 2 degrees of warming. And they both involve net negative emissions at some point, so meaning that we sequester, we take more CO2 out of the atmosphere than we emit into it. Now, if we look at what the future holds, the Sixth Assessment Report has a fairly simple graphic. It plots the total cumulative CO2 emissions. So this is the total amount of anthropogenic net CO2 that we have emitted into the atmosphere since 1850. Plotted against the degree of warming that we experience. So the gray part in this plot here is the historical period, and the colored parts are these 5 different scenarios. And as you can see, it's pretty simple. It's quite straightforward. For every 2,000 gigatons of CO2, we have experienced in the past, and we will continue to experience, about 1 degree of warming. So in other words, every bit of CO2 that we dig out of the ground and emit into the atmosphere contributes to warming, and this carbon in the atmosphere and in the ocean has a lifetime, a residence time in the system that measures in millennia, and so it's essentially totally cumulative. Almost every molecule of CO2 that we have emitted since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution is still out there contributing to warming. And not only that, a lot of the CO2 is absorbed into the ocean, where it drives acidification. So this is shown here, the top plot. So acidification means the pH decreases, and that is, quite predictably, what the additional CO2 will do. The amount of acidification depends quite a lot on the scenario, though, that we are going to follow. And likewise, the warming, over 90% of the additional heat in the climate system is in the ocean, where that heat drives expansion of the ocean waters. That's one component of sea level rise. The other component is loss of land ice, ice caps and glaciers that, is responsible for another major contribution to sea level rise. So by the end of the century, we'll be looking at 1.5 to 1 meter of sea level rise, except in the situation where perhaps we have if there's an ice sheet collapse, for example, then we could see the scenario shown here on the dashed line, which is more like 1.5 meters of sea level rise by the end of the century. And of course, sea level rise is a slow process. It doesn't stop at the end of the century. So in 2300, we would possibly look at anything up to 7 meters or maybe more of sea level rise, depending on the scenario that we follow. So these are all, in a, let's say, a 5 meter sea level rise scenario, much of Wellington, for example, would be, the central part of Wellington would be underwater. So in summary, the report in quite unprecedented detail shows that recent climate change is widespread, it's rapid, it's intensifying, and it's unprecedented in millennia. It's clear that human activities are causing this change, and one aspect of it is that various extreme climate events become more frequent and more severe. Every fraction of a degree of global warming makes these climate impacts worse. not just in heat, but also in precipitation, in acidification, in extreme events. They're all basically tied to either directly to the warming or to the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere. And climate change is already affecting every region on the planet in multiple ways. This is both, I mean, it means there's no way to hide from it. But in the end, the report comes up with a positive message, namely that rapid, deep, and sustained cuts to emissions can still avert the worst consequences of climate change. In other words, the choices that we make, especially in this decade, about mitigation of climate change, are very important in this context. Now, as we look forward to COP26, this raises various ethical and legal and societal and political questions here that are all not covered in the report because it's only about physical science in this Working Group 1 report that's come out. Questions about intergenerational equity. Is it fair that my generation is having a party and is polluting the atmosphere with CO2 and the next generations are having to pay the price essentially? How about international justice? Is it fair that the first world is, responsible for most of the problem that we have, and not many of the third world countries, especially small island states and some others, have to pay the price? There's an intersection of climate change with those 17 sustainable development goals that were formulated that are about eradication of poverty, of hunger, of, it's about education and other things. All of these are affected by climate change, especially. Yeah, and then there's a question of, who is going to shoulder the burden of the adaptation and mitigation. Adaptation, well, people may have to move, all sorts of things may have to happen that can be expensive, and some countries are better placed to pay for this than others. So one overriding message is that urgent action is needed, or otherwise we will not meet the Paris goals. That's basically what you can more or less directly take from this report. So maybe I'll just leave it at this and back to Julie.
Thank you so much, Olaf. That was perfect timing, literally
right.
10 minutes, amazing. Our final speaker is Professor Priya Kurian. Priya is a professor of political science and public policy at the University of Waikato. Her work spans multiple disciplines, including environmental politics, gender politics, critical public policy, and development studies. She's published extensively on climate justice, including Climate Futures, Reimagining Climate Justice, and was a plenary speaker at the IPCC's Cities and Climate Change Science Conference in Edmonton, Canada in 2018. She's co-led a project on centering culture and climate adaptation in Aotearoa, New Zealand, funded by the Deep South National Science Challenge.
Thank you very much, Julie. Tēnā koutou katoa, no inia oku tupuna, e noho ana o ki kirikiriroa. He aharangi aho ki te whare wananga o Waikato, e mihi ana ki ngā tohu o nehe o Aotearoa, e noho ne o. Ko Priya Kurian toku ingoa, no reira, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou tātou. Thank you very much for this invitation to be part of this webinar. I mean, it's a real privilege to be here, and it has been fantastic to listen to all of the preceding speakers. In fact, I think there's going to be a fair degree of resonance in terms of what I say with what started the webinar with Julianne's comments. It feels really hard to say something about the IPCC AR6 report because it has been so heavily commented on and with such erudition. But at the risk of possibly repeating what Olaf just said and what Pip flagged earlier, I suppose the four things that really struck me as I was looking at the report are things that you have just heard, in a sense, that the Earth is looking to reach 1.5 degrees centigrade increase within 2 decades, if not sooner, which is a much shorter time frame than we had previously been told. 2, that human activities are definitely causing climate change. There are no longer any maybes about it. 3, that the carbon absorbing capacity of our natural sinks, the oceans and forests and land, is decreasing with the increase in global emissions. But finally, despite how dire all this sounds, I think it's also clear from the report, and taking up the point that Olaf made towards the very end of his presentation, it's also clear that we do have time to act if we take drastic action. So in other words, the worst case scenario that the IPCC report flags for us is not inevitable, but much remains in terms of how we make decisions. Now, there's so much that has the ring of familiarity in this report. We have known about climate change for a very long time now. The thing is, and this might sound a bit provocative, we don't really need more science in order to act. Instead, we need to ask, what is it that stops us from acting with more urgency and in a way that recognizes not only our common humanity, but also our ties of care, compassion, and responsibility to each other and to the planet? And the answers to this question are many, and they are multi-layered, and I'm not possibly going to be able to pick up on all of those answers, but let me start with the answer that comes up at a systemic level. And I think at a systemic level, we need to recognize the role of colonialism and capitalism, the depredations of colonialism and capitalism, and that is the destruction of peoples, the plunders of societies and economies, the large-scale destruction of biodiversity, and the creation of an economic system based on unchecked profiteering and exploitation of people and the planet are at the heart of our climate crisis. This is not a thing of the past, it is here and now. And it plays out every day in terms of the climate change impacts that we can see happening around the world. So what that does is that it does, or it should do, it put the idea of climate justice at the heart of how we understand and respond to climate change. And that means, in part, recognizing the centrality of Indigenous knowledge and Indigenous values in shaping what we do. So these systems of colonialism and capitalism, literally fueled by fossil fuels, are deeply embedded. They permeate the structures for society, our politics, our economy, and our culture. So climate change is not a problem out there that can be fixed by a technological solution, or there is no silver bullet that we can use to make the problem go away. And that picks up on what Julian said at the beginning. Climate change is really an embodiment of our society, of us, of how we consume, how we design our cities, of the decisions that our politicians and economic elites make. It is in fundamental ways, as the novelist Amitav Ghosh said, a crisis of culture. So when we talk about efforts to mitigate and adapt to climate change, a key point that I would emphasize is that this can only be effective if such efforts pay attention to the cultural aspects of the lives of both communities and individuals. For example, let's take a look at the actions frequently recommended by the IPCC. And here I'm thinking about an earlier report, 2019, Climate Change and Land, but even the many reports that IPCC has put together for us. And the recommendations include things such as building individual and institutional capacity, accelerating knowledge transfer, enhancing technology transfer, enabling financial mechanisms, undertaking risk management, and so on. All of these are really, really important, but they can be effectively implemented only if policymakers engage with people's diverse values, contexts, needs, experiences, and desires in developing the strategies for climate mitigation and adaptation. So in other words, we need to engage with all sectors of society, including especially Indigenous communities and our vulnerable sectors, whether these are migrants, refugees, the poor, the youth, women, and so on. Engage them in meaningful conversations about how to bring about the transformative change we need. And so for that to happen, we need disruptive action. And that means that does not mean chaos, right? I mean, disruptive action often gives people a sense of shock. Oh my God, what might that entail? But actually what it does mean is making the decisions to turn off the tap on the most destructive activities of the day in an equitable and just way. So here's another example. I recently signed an open letter calling for a fossil fuel non-proliferation treaty to enact a global equitable phase out of fossil fuels. And it calls for three things: ending new expansion of fossil fuel production, phasing out existing production of fossil fuels, and investing in a transformational plan to ensure 100% access to renewable energy globally, and thereby enable a just transition. Now, the IPCC's reports have shown that in order to stay under the 1.5 degrees C, greenhouse gas emissions really need to be at least 45% lower globally by 2030. Instead, what we have is a fossil fuel industry that is planning to increase production by 2% each year from here on. It's not completely bad news. Yesterday, we had China make a really significant announcement that it's announced it will no longer fund the building of coal-fired plants in any of its overseas investments. Now that's huge. I mean, so there is hope. The urgent task, in other words, is to reduce both the supply as well as the demand for oil, coal, and gas. And to be just and equitable, rich countries need to transition faster to reducing fossil fuel production and use in order to enable developing countries to reduce their fossil fuel production and consumption at a slower pace, and provide the finance and technology that they need. Now, often the response to such proposed action is to ask, can we afford to do this? And I think the real question is, can we afford not to? So this IPCC report is yet again a reminder that what we need at COP26 in Glasgow is to see nations, especially wealthy nations, committing to disrupting the status quo. Are we likely to see that? Well, I guess our past experiences with COPs is mixed, but here's what I think would be just fantastic to see countries agree to do. One is much more ambitious nationally determined contributions, right? We need much greater and much faster reduction in our emissions, and we need this predominantly from the rich countries. There's a small group of countries, the United States, UK, EU27, Japan, and China, that account for about 68% of the global climate budget. And the IPCC has just told us that the budget is, in fact, much smaller than what had been expected. So it raises fundamental questions of equity. How do developing countries continue to develop when the developed world is continuing to hog more than its fair share of the carbon budget? Second, we need support for, if not the fossil fuel non-proliferation treaty, then something like that. I can talk more about later about the fact that fossil fuel industry has been, unfortunately, participating in previous COPs in unhealthy ways. Now, a third thing that would be essential to see at COP26, although again, there are no guarantees, is to see a significant increase in the Green Climate Fund. Climate finance is essential to ensure equity in access to mitigation and adaptation. The promise was $100 billion a year from 2020. We're nowhere close to that amount. So just in closing, I just want to take a quick comment on Aotearoa New Zealand. If you look at Climate Action Tracker's assessment of New Zealand's climate policies and Paris commitments, its overall rating is highly insufficient and critically insufficient. So we need to be more ambitious here in Aotearoa in living up to our ethical and moral obligations to the world, but also to ourselves. And so we need not only to use all levers of government, but also civil society, you and I and all of us, to put pressure on our politicians to do the right thing. So I'd like to end with a reference to another novelist and essayist, Arundhati Roy, who said in the context of recovery from COVID-19 that we need to be ready to imagine another world. Can we then imagine a world where we can prioritize green over greed, kinship over class, and equity over exploitation? The good news is that there are Indigenous and historically marginalized communities around the world who are doing just that. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Priya, and thanks to all of the panelists. So much to think about and discuss. I'm going to start with some questions that were suggested by the organizers of this event, and then we'll move into the audience questions after that. And really, you don't all three need to answer all of them, but feel free to jump in and let me know which ones you do want to answer. So start, how are Crown research institutions like NIWA ensuring that scientific data and knowledge gets used appropriately? Does this involve CRIs creating close relationships with other organizations or industry bodies that know their specific sectors, such as the New Zealand Transport Agency on transport issues?
I suppose that's the question for me. Yes, I mean, so we uphold pretty stringent scientific ethics standards regarding our data. I mean, we hold that we don't make up our data. We do the best we can to have, robust data that underpin this. I mean, the sixth assessment report here is not mainly based, of course, on NIWA data. It is based on a very large body of international data of all sorts of provenance that gets used here, and and the scientific body is sort of self-policing, if you like, through peer review and so on, and to uphold these standards that we have robust data that underpin this. So there is no, I mean, some people have sometimes said that we're in this to make money and for the funding and so on. That's nonsense. I mean, yes, of course we need funding, but we're there because we are passionate about this and because we believe in these standards. And yes, NIWA does have relationships with various other players in this field. Yeah, but they have no bearing on the validity and rigorousness of our data, I'd say.
Would any of the other panelists like to add to that, or we'll move on to the next question?
I might quickly just jump in. Social science research is obviously very different from the natural and hard sciences. But I guess in terms of just the question of who uses the knowledge we produce, the nature of social science research, even though it's really diverse, is often there is an applied aspect to it. So the insights that are generated can inform thinking of key actors in society, of government, of civil society, and so on. But also things, for instance, research that I do, for instance, on public engagement. Those ideas around how best to engage with the public are insights that can then inform the kinds of engagements that are practiced by others, including government. So I think it's a different kind of relationship, but important in informing just the practice, policy practice, and policy insights.
Just really quickly to both of you, I mean, do you think science, both physical science and social science, gets enough public funding in Aotearoa?
Quick answer would be no, especially, but I mean, there is actually, I don't know whether crisis is the wrong word, but there's clearly an inadequacy of funding of the social sciences and the humanities, and it cripples the ability to produce the kind of research that is so essential in our time.
Yeah, I mean, there's an OECD goal for countries to spend 3% of their GDP on research and development and science. The latest number that I have in my head is about 1.4% or so for New Zealand, which puts it at the bottom of the developed world pretty much. So it shows in everything we do, in funding successes and so on and so forth. It's we're not a shining example by any standard, really.
No, and I think that'll be true with respect to climate change, but also I've been hearing it even in our
Yeah, across the board.
Yeah. A slightly different topic. And this could be for any of you, do you think there is appropriate representation of key sectors in international forums like COPs? And, you know, that could be transport, agriculture, fisheries, but it could also be the types of indigenous communities that Priya is referring to. And is appropriate representation needed for accurate decision-making in those particular forums, particularly in increasing the legitimacy of the forums? Can different sectors collaborate domestically to support reaching international goals and expectations? I feel like you each might have a different perspective on what voices are missing or not from COP, and whether there needs to be more representation from different sectors in order for the COP itself to gain legitimacy and make good recommendations and decisions.
Yeah.
Jump in, Priya, go ahead.
Yeah, I wasn't right. I'll jump in. I think, speaking specifically of COP, there are avenues to allow participation in the form of observers to be there from civil society, and this includes youth and NGOs and indigenous groups and trade unions and women and so on. COP itself, the 2 weeks that we see happening once a year in different host countries, those 2 weeks are a forum really for governments to negotiate the finer details of what happens in terms of implementation and of things that they have agreed to. So the question of, is there scope for actors to collaborate domestically? I mean, Julian probably has a really good sense of what happens in the Aotearoa context, but I imagine that is definitely happening, that when governments go out and take a position on international forums, they are representing in many ways decisions that have been made domestically. I think, just in terms of legitimacy and so on, one of the problems with previous COPs, and I think this is possibly less of an issue this time, is the fact that fossil fuel companies have been active in previous climate COPs. So they've been there as sponsors, and they have there in very significant ways. And I think that is really a problem in skewing the debate, because enormously wealthy, resourced actors who are one of the fundamental causes of climate change are there sitting with decision makers. So that's.
So the one sector that I'd really like to see heavily represented at COP is the science sector. Okay, so we do need people to listen to what, you know, okay, they will only have the first of 3 volumes available at the time of that conference, but they can probably imagine what the other 2 will say. You know, I mean, they do have to listen to science. Okay, so if they don't listen to science, and at previous conferences of the party, they didn't sufficiently listen to science, you know, it only means that a few years later we're deeper in the trouble, really. So yeah, I mean, that's my view on it.
Pip, do you have any thoughts?
Well, I would just add, I guess, just to the legitimacy question, you know, we tend to see less follow through than everybody hopes for. And so potentially the COPs could be supported by more regional action, maybe outside of the government sector that tries to promote the speed of change that we need, because I think that's where we get a little bit disheartened with the COPs, where they happen, we get all excited, there's some big headline announcements, and then we just have years of not meeting what we need, what we've set out to do.
Following on from that, Pip, what do you think is needed from the private sector perspective to support the development of sustainable finance and business models? Is there an opportunity in the international forum to support this?
2 things I would say to that question. One is we need to change our business models. we need to change, discounted cash flow calculations. We need to change the way we make decisions that focus on these short-term financial profits, and in the most case, miss all the other impacts that a particular decision has in it. I mean, that is a very complex thing to do, though, and it's not going to happen overnight. That is, I guess, a fundamental change we need to see happen, so that we take a holistic approach to decision making, rather than this focus on kind of shorter term financial returns. In the shorter term, I think there's a huge gap in terms of being able to fund and finance projects or companies that aren't kind of at scale or higher risk than an institutional investor's risk appetite. Because we can see that there's a lot of capital available, but it all is going towards projects that meet certain kind of risk and return profiles. And so what isn't getting funded is technologies that are early stage or smaller projects. And we need all those projects to start getting funding to kind of see the pace of change that's required.
Olaf and Priya, do you have anything to add to that, or no? Great. As a result of the assessment report, what is one key takeaway you think relates to your respective sector that should be addressed and considered in the COP forum? I feel like you've all addressed this somewhat, but if there's one key thing, maybe starting with Olaf.
Yeah, I mean, the one key message is that we are running out of time, and we must cut back our emissions. I mean, if we don't do that, then we're looking at a pretty dire future. So, yeah, that's maybe in a nutshell what these people need to know.
Priya, have you got one key takeaway?
Maybe just a re-emphasizing of climate justice. I mean, this idea that, yes, we need to tackle the big issues of fossil fuel and biodiversity and so on, but we need to do it in a just and equitable way. And, Kate Raworth's donut model is a way of thinking about how we might actually do it, but it is essential if we hope to make the progress we need to.
And Pip?
I guess I just following on from Olaf's comments. I mean, it's not really new. I mean, it heightens the speed of the problem and the pace of what we're seeing unfold. And so I guess it's like the communication piece. The more we can communicate the science, the more we talk about it, the less it can be put away on the back burner or people can forget about it. So I guess that's my one key insight.
And how would you say, and this is again for all three of you, your particular sector is supporting diversity in perspectives in climate change response, and particularly Indigenous knowledge and process? How can an Indigenous approach to climate change response be strengthened in your area? And this time maybe I was going to go backwards. If you're happy to start, Pip.
Well, I was just going to say, I mean, actually, I think we do a lot of work with organisations looking at how they think about climate risk, and it is amazing when we go to the iwi or the Maori sector, their view on what long-term means completely changes the perspective of what is considered in that, in someone's risk assessment of climate change. Our kind of traditional view is that long-term is maybe 5 years. Sometimes we push people out to think as long as the asset life of something. But when we take the Maori worldview, it's almost, kind of eternal. It's how that land will support future generations. And when you look at it in that lens, the problem becomes crystal clear. So I think we've got a huge amount to learn from embedding that into our thinking further.
Priya, this seems like something you consider a lot in your work. Is there anything you want to add?
Well, I mean, I suppose if, I know the question is around the sectors we are representing. And so if we are thinking about the academic sector, I mean, there is no question that facilitating the synergies between Mātauranga Māori and for want of a better word, Western science approaches are really important in whether you're talking about social or the natural sciences. But in addition, I think prioritizing indigenous values. So if you're thinking about it in the Aotearoa context, values of whanangotanga, manakitanga, kaitiakitanga, whakapapa, mana, these values help us, whether it's in the academic sector or outside, rethink our relationship with the planet and all living things. So I think what an indigenous perspective does is that it really brings home to us the inseparability of humans and non-human nature, and the importance of both the whenua and the whānau in shaping our responses. So I mean, I think what Pip said, that intergenerational perspective, but also the sense of kinship with not just humans, is something that is so vitally important, and it changes how we think about life and work and climate.
Olaf.
Yes, so I'm on the leadership team of the Deep South National Science Challenge, where Vision Mataranga is a key pillar of what we do. And indeed, I fully agree with Priya. I mean, the Western values essentially are what created the problem, namely the sort of greed and the idea that we have to exploit nature as quickly as we can. And yeah, we don't have this long-term view. And yeah, in the Maori world, the guardianship of the planet is a key pillar, the manakitanga. And yeah, so it will require a change in our values in order to address the problem, is my impression. I mean, for the rest of us who are not Maori. So yeah, that's perhaps as much as I can say there.
Do you feel that within the international science community, an Indigenous perspective is being elevated alongside?
So in my world of sort of physical science, where we make measurements and so on, not too much. In fact, in this country, one problem that we have is that there are not many Maori in physical science. But the response to climate change is one where, at least in this country, Maori play a key role in informing, the values that need to underpin our response to this problem. So, I mean, I would love to see more Maori come through the science sector, and for some reason, not many, but yeah, maybe that's a separate story.
So I'll move on to the attendee. Thank you very much for all those answers. I think it's really, it is interesting, and it still is open-ended. I'm going to move on to the attendee questions. And the first one asks, what actions businesses are taking around environmental sustainability when it comes to packaging? It's outrageous that in supermarkets, products are not required to sell refills for the dispensers, even when they advertise that these are available. I think maybe Pip, you might be best placed to speak to this.
I guess I give a very short answer. There is things like the plastic declaration, etc., that companies are signing up to, which is to remove all packaging that's not compostable, recyclable, or reusable. A lot of organisations signing up to it. It's not quite clear how they're going to meet those requirements. I think that's probably the big issue. There is a lot of work going on at MFE to develop product stewardship schemes, etc., for what they call priority products. So there is a significant amount of work going on in the waste space. It just takes time to be able to build the infrastructure to be able to have these new packages, these new packaging materials be able to be reused or recycled. So there is action going on. It's not at the pace we need it, like a lot of these things, I guess, is the key issue.
Are any of you aware if what other countries are further ahead of Aotearoa in this issue and doing better at waste minimization, regulating packaging?
Yeah, maybe I can speak to, I'm German, and, in Germany, for example, Germany has one of the higher rates of recyclable products, circulating in consumption, but a lot of them don't actually get recycled. So this, maybe it looks better than it actually is. refillable bottles, for example, is one thing that we just don't seem to do in this country that could be done. That would take out a lot of these plastic bottles that are, a lot of them are floating in the ocean or end up in places in some third world countries where they're not supposed to be.
Olaf, do you think in Germany that the waste minimization approach was driven more by consumers or by governments?
It's both, I'd say. I mean, government responds to consumer pressure, okay? Consumers are voters, and in Germany, it was initially driven by lack of space in landfills and lack of options of what to do with this ton of material that is, has to be dealt with somehow. And for some time, Germany has been exporting their waste, but that is not a strategy. That is just, it's a crime in some regard. So the idea that we have to have a circular economy is well established in a lot of people's heads, but getting there is not quite so easy. I mean, it's, again, profitability of products and so on is at stake here. And maybe creativity in the design of products so that they simply don't leave so much waste behind.
Priya, from a social science perspective, do you have any comments on how this change or transformation could be driven? Have you seen any research? It seems to me that most consumers actually don't want the waste, but they haven't got the choice, and they're going to choose what's most convenient or easily available.
So if we think about just plastic bags, one of the interesting things in terms of looking at overseas examples is that the initial bans on plastic bags actually happened in developing countries. It was Bangladesh, I think, which was the first country. And according to the research that I've been reading, because I've been teaching this, the reason for countries in the third world to succeed in doing it relatively without hindrance was because they did not have a vested interest in the form of a fossil fuel lobby group in their countries at the time when the bans happened. And I think that has been one of the issues if you think about New Zealand. I'm aware of, including the Green Party, taking up campaigns to try and get plastic bag bans and action on packaging and so on in previous years. And the reason why it got shot down is because clearly the power of the lobby groups in favor of status quo, and there wasn't sufficient consumer pressure at that time. I think that's shifting, and that's shifted. There's greater consciousness, but the more we can make it transparent, who benefits and who loses from the decisions, the better chances we have. So that's so what the research shows: one, absence or minimal presence of lobby groups, but also, on the other hand, environmental organizations working with members of the public to create the kind of demand and awareness that puts pressure on politicians to do the right thing.
Just to add to that point, Priya, I used to live in Melbourne, and at that time they had a series called The War on Waste. And what it did was they put GPS trackers in where what was being recycled, where it actually ended up. And the realization and just the awareness it brought of the issue put it on the agenda so firmly, because the whole country suddenly became aware of the issue. And I think there's more room for kind of creative activism in those spaces to kind of make this unavoidable for governments.
Cool. Moving on to the next attendee question. This is for Olaf. There's decreasing scientific literacy and increasing distrust in science, and this appears to have been exacerbated by COVID-19. What role can civil society organizations and individuals play in being a bridge between the average citizen and scientific experts in their knowledge?
Yeah, I mean, so I disagree a bit with the premise of the question that the distrust in science was enhanced by COVID-19. Actually, I'm quite. I mean, especially in this country, the response of government was a lot driven by science. It wasn't my science, but that doesn't matter in this context. You know, the Prime Minister and others took on the advice that they got, and the result is that we have one of the lowest rates of mortality and so far amongst the best outcomes of this pandemic in anywhere in the world. So I disagree with the premise that so COVID and the solution to this problem is also science, and namely well, vaccines for the most part. But what role can individuals and others play? Yes, so I think you know, the education sector plays, of course, a very large role in this. Schools and universities. I've got, you know, 2 kids who one has finished and the other is still in school here, and they need to learn about this, you know, throughout their school career, because it's going to shape their lives, you know, as they move forward. Yeah, I mean, yeah, I don't know whether individuals, of course, I mean, you know, so usually the activists who propagate the message are not often the same as the scientists, because we scientists are used to, you know, holding back our emotions and casting everything in a sort of dry, you know, scientific language, which maybe is not the language that needs to be used here, okay, arguably, but there's a space for this. I mean, the 6th assessment report, for example, is having a very big impact, is my impression, at least for the moment. It's cast in that dry, unemotional scientific language. You know, everybody has their role, scientists have their role and others have their roles too. So activists are, you know, we need those, but they do need to ground their activity a bit in science. That would be good in some cases.
And I think this comes back to what Priya was saying about social science and research on communication, and that, yeah, exactly, how to communicate, which is a different science that we need to fund so that governments can effectively do it.
Right. I mean, just to jump in on that, I think there is a lot of research around that whole question around how do we communicate. But one of the things that's been, that research has found is that speaking about vaccinations, and it's not necessarily always the case that people are anti-vaxxers as much as that there is hesitancy and anxiety. And so rather than talk to, and I think, you know, we can see parallels with climate change, although now denialism takes the form of delayism, and that's probably a slightly different story. But how we talk to people, you know, taking on board seriously what the concern might be, and to be able to communicate a kind of reassurance about the safety of something or the importance of something without it feeling like an attack on their intellect or their, you know, it's not about saying how stupid you are, but really making connections and being able to connect people's concerns about family or the environment or life to the issue at hand. So there is a lot of great research out there that, you know, individuals can tap into in terms of thinking about how we do the communication in a way that is non-threatening and non-aggressive.
I think that's really helpful. The next question, any of you, if you have knowledge about this, should people living on small islands in the Pacific and displaced by climate change or rising seawater be viewed by the United Nations as refugees? And is this on the agenda at COP26, as far as anyone's aware? You go, Priya.
Should I you know, I think it was a time of probably an election or two back that there was a proposal in New Zealand to recognize Pacific Island communities who may seek refugee status, you know, to acknowledge the status, their status as climate refugees. But really the word from Pacific Island peoples themselves is that they don't really want to be seen as victims, and often the language of refugees can can portray people merely as passive victims. And I think the message we get from Pacific Islands islanders and governments from there is that rather than talk about climate refugees, at least in this particular regional and local context, what perhaps would be much more helpful would be for countries like New Zealand and Australia to actually get on with cutting emissions and providing the aid that's necessary to help with climate adaptation. Is it on the agenda for COP26? Not to my knowledge.
Thanks for that. Next question, COVID issues aside, do you think New Zealand will be able to continue with our tourism sector when currently travel, especially air travel, requires unnecessary consumption of fossil fuels?
Maybe I can just jump in here. So yeah, that is a very good question. So somebody coming here, you know, from 10,000 kilometers away, I mean, so the per capita emissions of CO2 by air travel are about the same per person and per kilometer flown as driving in your car. Except in your car, you don't drive 10,000 kilometers in one go, you drive, you know, maybe 100 kilometers or so. So in other words, flying is an extremely large privilege in this context. Making flying sustainable, there are some ideas on the horizon. Electric planes or hydrogen powered planes perhaps, but they are clearly not here yet, and it'll be years before they are, you know, operational. So previous, you know, the Kyoto Agreement, for example, excluded air traffic emissions. They were not accounted for because people couldn't apportion these emissions to individual countries, and that's of course a scandal. And that is, it's completely, it doesn't matter where the CO2 emissions are produced. You know, eventually they're well mixed and they appear everywhere. So air travel is used to have growth rates of about 5% per year until the pandemic hit, which is completely unsustainable, of course. So yeah, I mean, how New Zealand is, you know, they made itself very dependent on these long distance flying tourists. We have learned now to do without them for a year and a half. Maybe there's a lesson to learn here.
Yeah, you go.
Well, I was going to add, there is, I guess, a lot of action on this again in Europe. So I think France has now banned any domestic flights, or they might even be international flights that are under 2 hours. But the key difference is they obviously have a high-speed train network that can supplement and make that travel, or the other modes of travel that are less emission intensive that are available, which aren't available in New Zealand. But there obviously is then things like density questions that are different in New Zealand to Europe. So is there the need for the same type of infrastructure? So there's some interesting questions. There's a lot of pressure on that kind of reduction of air travel, where there are other effective means happening now, as we can see in Europe. And there is, again, a lot of kind of work, really early stage work in place about how to kind of green tourism. And just to add one extra thought about it, I think that the tourism sector should really see it as kind of almost a long-term value creation thing to think about, because prior to COVID, you know, we heard this term come out of Scandinavia again about flight shaming, and it wasn't really taken very seriously in this part of the world. But no one now will expect business travel to go back to where it was pre-COVID. So these are real risks to the tourism sector, and so. You know, if we don't green it over the longer term, it will be, you know, significant for kind of that longer term value creation question.
Yeah, interesting timing for so many different New Zealand cities to have put so much investment in convention centers right in time for COVID and climate change. You know, one of the questions is, we've got a question from an audience member. As a country that relies heavily on our agricultural industry, what recommendations are being given to our farmers and those involved in the agricultural sector? But just prior to that, I just thought the issue of international air travel and how it's accounted for raises a whole issue about how this approach has worked, where we're relying on countries to count for all of their production emissions and then come up with plans. I've certainly heard that somehow New Zealand, because we feed the world and we don't consume all of our agricultural products here, then we shouldn't count all of our emissions from agriculture. But if that were true, then we also would have to start counting all the emissions from all the products that we import from other countries, and developing countries in particular, that have much higher emissions. And I'm just wondering, well, I guess there's a specific question about agriculture in New Zealand, but also from a COP perspective, do you think there's any chance of us looking at an emissions breakdown in a different way and trying to account for it and address it other than country by country production emissions?
Yeah, I mean, you're completely right that these exported emissions are, are a major issue. I mean, China, for example, is now the biggest emitter on the planet as a country, and that's because they're the factory of the world and export almost everything that they, well, a lot of what they produce goes to other countries. And yeah, but of course we don't account for this. So I mean, it's the reducing emissions doesn't just involve us driving less and flying less. It also simply involves us consuming less, because almost every product that we can buy contains embedded emissions. So would it be good to account for that? Yes, it would be good. I don't know how practical it is.
I guess one of the concerns I had is some of the more developed countries that have demonstrated a reduction in emissions, how much of that is due to outsourcing production of consumer goods, which they're just importing back in.
So there is, again, in Europe, the carbon aborted adjustment tax that's been proposed, or mechanism that's been proposed in Europe, which would then, and at the moment, I think they're phasing it in where it would be those high emission sectors that would be impacted first, that anything that was actually consumed in Europe would have to pay that price. That is under discussion in the US, although I guess it's debatable about what carbon price they're hoping to save their local industries from facing in some regions, but also Canada. And so I guess those types of mechanisms would account a little bit for the consumption footprint. It's not going to solve the problem because ag at the moment is excluded everywhere, for instance. But there is work underway. Again, everything takes so much time to actually implement, though, which I guess is this key problem. So even what's being discussed now isn't really implemented for another 5 years or so, and then it's kind of phased in, so that there is that time lag for actually seeing the changes occur.
Moving on to the other, in terms of New Zealand and agriculture, has anyone got any thoughts about recommendations being given to our farmers and those involved in the agricultural sector about what role they can play in reducing emissions?
We actually just did through the Centre of Sustainable Finance, we did a piece of work that looked at the EU taxonomy and what it had set out for agriculture. So it did cover agriculture and is likely to be brought in at the end of the year. That really tries to set out guidance or a standard around what is environmentally sustainable in the sector. So we took a look at what that was in Europe and was it applicable for New Zealand. It resulted in a guidance piece called the Sustainable Agricultural Finance Initiative. But basically it is guidance about what in other regions is kind of deemed as environmentally sustainable. So it does focus on regenerative practices. It focuses on understanding your emissions, which is what Hawaka Ekanoa is focused on at the farm level and having reduction plans in place for those. It also focuses on biodiversity, pollution, and water quality and water consumption. So there are lots of domestic other standards out there focused at the consumer level about sustainability as well. So there is lots of guidance and leading practice around this. I guess it's about how we kind of get the uptake and the speed of practice or behaviour changes as well to kind of, I guess, scale action.
I had a quick question, Pip. Was there also advice on reducing intensification? So for instance, with dairy farming and so on, like rather than find ways around intensification, has there been a message that we just need to reduce the number of animals on farms and so on?
I'd have to go back to the actual detail in the standard. It's definitely a topic that is discussed, and I'm pretty certain the way those international standards are structured, there's this, first of all, do no significant harm criteria, and I'm without going and checking this, I'm certain there'll be a focus on not increasing the absolute emissions, even if the emission intensity starts to decrease, that there's a cap on absolute emissions. And I'm assuming that would then lead to kind of like a cap on kind of head of cattle in a way as well, unless you know we have zero emission cows. But there is definitely a focus on absolute emission reductions, not just emission intensity improvements.
Maybe if I can just inject one bit here. So the agricultural emissions are mostly in the form of methane, is the biggest contributor there. And methane, unlike CO2, does not accumulate in the system. I said earlier that, you know, a molecule of CO2 is in the system for millennia, whereas a molecule of methane is in the system only for about 10 years, which means that the amount of methane in the atmosphere is more or less in equilibrium with the emissions that we have, because it's removed at about the same rate as we produce it. So this means the agricultural sector, fortunately for us, does not have to bring its emissions of methane down to zero. It just has to make sure that it's not growing any further, essentially.
I think we're running a bit short on time, so we won't make all of the questions, but I was wondering if very quickly, the three panelists, if you want to each give a one-word answer to this. Do you think the government, and I assume it's the New Zealand government, has been too sensitive to the concerns of sectors that are reluctant to change?
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, I'd like to see faster change. Let's put it like this.
Yes, I think this is the move from shareholder capitalism to stakeholder capitalism. Yes.
Awesome. Well, thank you very much. And thanks to all of the attendees for your excellent questions. And I think it's just been a fascinating discussion. I'm just going to pass on to Gaia Paranisamy, the UNAN's president, for final closing.
Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. A very good evening to all of you. On behalf of our United Nations Association of New Zealand, it is an immense pleasure to deliver a vote of thanks to those who have been involved in this event. Firstly, I want to thank Honourable Julie and Janta for making the time and effort to facilitate the panel discussion. I want to thank the panelists, Dr. Olaf Morgenstern, Pete Best, and Professor Priya Kurian for your time and effort in participating in this discussion. It was a very stimulating discussion with fascinating information shared, and I'm sure this has provided us with a good understanding of the topic, code red for humanity. And all of you have done amazing things, and thank you for sharing your inspiring stories with us. Last but not least, I would like to commend the great work by our events team, Suniva, Phoebe, and Macy, for all their effort in making this event happen. Many thanks to all of you for participating in this discussion. Looking forward to seeing all of you in our next event, which is the United Nations Day on the 28th of October at Shade 5. More information on the event could be obtained from our social media or website. Now, I would like to conclude this event with a closing karakia. Ka whakairie te tapu kia wātea ai te ara, kia tūruki whakataha ai, kia tūruki whakataha ai, hui e, tai ki e. Restrictions are moved aside, so the pathway is clear to return to everyday activities, enriched, unified, and blessed. Ngā mihi nui.
Thanks a lot.